Before we start, just a little kind of inside moment, a little behind the scenes moment here. One of the things that I just can't help but chuckle at when I'm up here is when we're reading a psalm and there's a word in the psalm that's kind of a hard word to pronounce, and the congregation reads it, and everybody kind of gets quiet for a second. And then you just pick up again, because normally when I'm listening to you, your voices are all so strong and in unison. That's one of the things about the Episcopal Church I love. And then there's a moment when it just kind of drops out and then comes back. So that happened today in our psalm. It was the ark. We heard it was an Ephratah, and it sounded like this to me. The ark. We heard it was we found it in the field. That's what it sounded like up here. So just for a moment, you got to know the plight of our lay readers, right? That's kind of a weekly thing for our lay readers, especially in the Old Testament, to have to wrestle with some of those words that they have. So I just got a chuckle about it, and so we do that up here. When moments like that happen, we can't help but laugh. Today is the feast of Christ the King, and I'll tell you a little bit about why that feast means something in the church, in the timing of the church year, in just a second. But I wanted to start just by pointing out what was on our bulletin this morning. It is the world's tallest statue of Christ the King. It is, that's a real thing. That's not something we just photoshopped. That's a real statue. It's the statue itself is 118 feet tall. With the mound and the crown, they say it's 170 feet tall from kind of ground level to the top of the crown. And it's in a town called Zweibrücken, Poland. I think that's how you pronounce it. I asked my wife. My wife grew up in a town that had a huge Polish population. I grew up 20 minutes away, but it was in an Italian town, and we never went into the Polish town. So I'm not good with Polish words. So Zweibrücken, Poland. So I don't know if Poland's on your bucket list for 2022 traveling, but if you make it there next year, if you stop through that town, the world's tallest statue of Christ the King is there. It was built, I thought when I saw that, it would probably have been built, 100 years ago or something like that. It was built in 2010, right? It was just recent. It was built in 2010 to give the nation a symbol of hope. Christ the King, a symbol of hope. Because we all, hope is a thing that we all need. And there are times in our lives when we need more of it than others. I think back to my mother when she was diagnosed with cancer. She would always kind of give herself little things to hope in being at, right? I'm gonna live long enough to be at this event. And at first it started with our wedding. My mother was diagnosed with cancer right when Sarah and I got engaged. So it was like, I'm gonna be around 6 months to go to your wedding. And we thought, Mom, it would be great if you could dream a little bigger than that, right? But that's where it started. And then it was, I'm going to be around long enough to see my son become a priest. I'm going to be around long enough to see my grandchild graduate high school. And I'm going to be around long enough. She kept putting these new goals, these new things to hope in, and still does to this day. She's been cancer-free 17 years. And she still, to this day, will say, well, I would just like to be around long enough to see the next thing. Right? Because we all need hope, right? Especially when we're struggling, especially when we're down. And the image of Christ the King is something that the church reminds us of once a year to give us hope. To give us hope. That all things end with Christ as King. Right? That's the very simple image that gives us hope. That all things end, no matter how messed up they might be, all things end coming under his rule and being made right. So this image of Christ the King is meant to give us hope. As we head into Christmas, as we head into Advent and the Christmas season, it's meant to give us hope. And there's two things in our readings that we see about when we need hope, and from this image. And the first is hope when the world feels hopeless. Now, I know all of us have lots of things to be thankful for, but there are times, right, we're human beings, there are times when we get a little down and things might seem hopeless, whether in our lives or in things bigger than us, beyond our control. And the image of Christ the King is meant to give us hope when the world seems hopeless. In our New Testament reading today that Greg read, we had a reading from the book of Revelation. And the very beginning of it has this really simple line that's so powerful to the Christians that were hearing it. It says, who are before his throne, talking about Jesus, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth. Now, maybe when we read Revelation, or if we dive into that line might not seem that important. But if you think about the early Christians and what they lived with at that time when they were being persecuted, right? When they lived in the most powerful empire the world had seen to that day, the Roman Empire, and that the leader of the Roman Empire was not a democratic empire. Caesar, who had the most power of any earthly leader of that day, had decided that they were his enemies. And so all the things that we get accustomed to thinking about that protect us, like police or military or justice systems, now are turning on the Christians to persecute them and hunt them down. They might think like the world is hopeless. It would be understandable if they had a moment where they thought the world has turned upside down. I don't understand it anymore. It doesn't make sense to me. It's going in a direction I can't figure out and I don't like, and it seems hopeless. And we wouldn't blame them for thinking that. And this image, right, at the very beginning of Revelation, which is written to these very Christians who are suffering in that circumstance, starts with, and from Jesus Christ, the ruler of the kings of the earth. Like, don't lose hope. Even though the world seems like it's upside down and hopeless and doesn't make sense, don't lose hope. Because over every earthly authority, there is the King of Kings. Eventually, it all ends up at his feet and gets made right. Don't lose hope. So this image of Christ the King is meant to encourage us when we find our world or the world, right? Depends on our circumstances, hopeless. That's the first one. And the second time it's a helpful image for us is when we're carrying a heavy burden that seems unjust and unfair. And so we see this in the gospel reading. Jesus, who is innocent, as we know, is been arrested, he's been beaten, he's being brought before Pilate, the Roman governor, on charges of treason, that he's an enemy of the Roman state. Jesus has not done anything meriting this, but because of the jealousy of the chief priest, he's there and they would like him dead. And Jesus is bearing the injustice of all of this situation as he stands before Pilate. And when Pilate confronts him, Jesus could talk about a lot of things. He could talk about how unfair this was. Jesus could make his case about how he's innocent. Jesus could tell him all the reasons why this is screwed up. But what Jesus does is actually talk about his kingdom, where that's not of this world. Because if it was of this world, Jesus tells him this wouldn't be happening. This wouldn't happen in my kingdom. And he bears the suffering, keeping his eyes on something different, right? A kingdom that's not of this world. And so many times, we have seasons in our life where we might bear things that we didn't ask for, that aren't really fair, that feel way too heavy for us to carry. And this image of Christ the King is the image that gives us hope, right? Because all those things are true, yet we endure because we believe with our whole heart at some point, whether it's in this world or the next, whether it's we see it with our eyes here or not, everything gets brought to his feet and made right. Right? That's not just injustices like Jesus bore, right? We hope and we hold hope that cancer gets brought before his feet and made right, right? Alzheimer's gets brought before his feet and made right. Sickness, death, all of it gets made right under his rule. We endure till that time comes. So I would encourage you to hold that image up, whether it's a real image like a giant 170-foot statue, right, or just the idea and the reminder when things seem hopeless or spinning out of control, or when we feel like we're saddled with a heavy burden that is unfair and we did not ask for it, nor did we want it, nor do we think we deserve it, and that we would have that image and that reminder in front of us. Because, you know, this feast day is at the end of the church year, because the church wants to remind us that as the year ends, right, everything will end with Christ as King. Everything ends with Christ as King. And this is a rare sign of cooperation, right? This feast wasn't an old feast. This feast came back up in the time of between World War I and World War II in Europe, when the countries in Europe, right, some Episcopalian, like England, some Lutheran, some Catholic, collaborated to bring this feast back. So we celebrated, our Catholic brothers and sisters celebrated, so do our Lutheran friends, right? Because they felt Europe was in a season where it needed to be reminded who was king, because there were things happening there that were not great. That's probably an understatement if you are a history buff, but you know, as we're building towards World War II, what's happening in Europe. And so I would encourage you to hold that image in your mind for the same reasons, right? There are seasons in our life, this may be one of them for you, where things are happening that aren't great, where you're carrying heavy burdens, or where your world seems to not make sense or seems hopeless. And I would hold this picture of Christ the King as a sign of hope to you. Endure. Everything eventually ends up at his feet and gets made right. Everything ends up with Christ as King. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.